The Pacific Ocean, June 20th, 1944, 2300 hours. Darkness had swallowed the vast expanse of water below, transforming the ocean into an ink-black void that seemed to reach up and consume everything it touched. Above this abyss, Lieutenant Dick Tripp stood on the portside landing platform of the USS Yorktown, feeling the salt spray lash against his face as the carrier plowed through 12-foot swells. The wind howled across the flight deck at 30 knots, adding its voice to the mechanical symphony of aircraft engines somewhere out there in the night. Tripp held his paddles loosely at his sides, his eyes scanning the darkness for the first glimmer of navigation lights. He was waiting for aircraft that should have returned hours ago. Aircraft whose pilots were flying on fumes, exhausted from combat, and now faced the single most terrifying challenge in all of naval aviation, landing on a carrier deck at night. Behind him, the flight deck crew moved with practiced efficiency, but Tripp could sense their tension. Everyone knew what was coming. Just hours earlier, during what would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Admiral Mark Mitcher had made an unprecedented decision. With the Japanese fleet retreating and American aircraft running critically low on fuel, Mitcher had ordered every light on Task Force 58 illuminated. Ships that had spent years perfecting the art of blending into darkness now blazed like cities on the water, creating a pathway home for pilots who were flying on nothing but determination and the last drops of aviation fuel. But light alone would not save them. What happened in the next 2 hours would determine whether these pilots lived or passed away, and everything depended on the men like Dick Tripp, the landing signal officers who stood between their brothers in arms and catastrophe. The year 1944 represented a turning point in carrier aviation, but it had been built on years of innovation, experimentation, and too many losses. To understand why this night was different, we need to go back to where it all began. In the early days of carrier aviation, landing on a moving ship was considered barely controlled chaos. When the USS Langley, America's first aircraft carrier, began operations in 1922, pilots had no guidance system whatsoever. They simply aimed for the deck and hoped for the best. The results were predictable and often tragic. Commander Kenneth Whiting, Langley's first executive officer, recognized that pilots needed help. During one training exercise, frustrated with an inexperienced pilot who kept coming in too high, Whiting grabbed the white hats from 2 nearby sailors and held one in each hand, using them to emphasize his hand signals. It was crude, improvised, and absolutely brilliant. The pilot understood immediately and landed safely. From this desperate improvisation, the role of the landing signal officer was born. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the LSO system evolved. Colored flags replaced white hats. Painted paddles replaced flags. A standardized set of signals developed through trial and error. But every advancement came with a price tag written in blood and twisted metal. Each crashed aircraft represented a lesson learned, a technique refined, a signal clarified. By the time World War II erupted across the Pacific, the United States Navy had developed a sophisticated system of 13 distinct paddle signals. Each signal conveyed critical information about the approaching aircraft's position relative to the ideal landing approach: too high, too low, too fast, too slow, left, right, hook not down, wheels not down, cut engine and land, wave off and try again. During daylight hours, skilled LSOs could bring aircraft aboard with reasonable safety. They could judge an aircraft's speed from its attitude, the angle of its wings and tail. They could hear the engine's pitch, understanding whether the pilot had enough power or was about to stall. They could see the subtle changes in altitude, the drift left or right, the incremental adjustments that meant the difference between a perfect 3-wire landing and a disaster. But when the sun went down, everything changed. Night carrier landings represented the absolute pinnacle of difficulty in aviation. Even today, with sophisticated electronics, computer-assisted landing systems, and decades of accumulated knowledge, night carrier landings remain the most stressful operation a naval aviator will ever perform. Studies have shown that pilots experience more anxiety about night landings than about combat itself. In 1944, they had none of those modern systems. They had darkness, they had waves, they had exhausted pilots and damaged aircraft, and they had men like Dick Tripp standing on exposed platforms with nothing but paddles and their own experience to guide those aircraft home. The problems of night landings seemed almost insurmountable. In darkness, the LSO could not judge aircraft attitude with the same precision. The sound of engines became unreliable over the noise of wind and waves. Depth perception vanished. The pilot could barely see the paddles, often catching only glimpses of movement against the dark sky. Worse still, pilots approaching at night suffered from what aviators call the black hole effect. With no horizon reference, no ground lights, no visual cues beyond the dim outline of the carrier. Pilots lost their ability to judge altitude and distance. Aircraft that appeared to be on a perfect approach would suddenly slam into the water 50 feet short of the deck, the pilots never realizing they were descending. Others would come in far too high, missing all the arresting wires and crashing into the barrier or plunging off the forward end of the ship. The statistics were horrifying. In the early years of night carrier operations, accident rates during night recoveries were more than 5 times higher than daylight operations. Pilots dreaded the call to night operations. Many considered it a delayed ending, a matter of when, not if. Something had to change. The first breakthrough came with the development of specialized aircraft lighting. Engineers recognized that the LSO needed more information than just the navigation lights required for safety. They needed to see the aircraft's attitude, to understand its angle of attack and speed without relying on visual cues that disappeared after dark. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Aircraft were equipped with a special approach light mounted in the leading edge of the left wing. This light contained 3 colored lenses arranged in a vertical line: red, yellow, and green. As the aircraft's nose pitched up or down, changing the angle at which the LSO viewed the light, different colors became visible. Red meant the aircraft was too slow, nose up, approaching a stall. Green meant too fast, nose down, likely to overshoot. Yellow, that perfect middle ground, meant the speed was just right. This innovation gave LSOs critical information they had been missing. Now, even in complete darkness, they could judge whether an approaching aircraft had enough airspeed to land safely. It was a game changer, reducing one major variable in the deadly equation of night landings. But it was not enough. The approach light solved the speed problem, but it did nothing for altitude control, lineup with the deck, or the dozens of other factors that determined success or failure. LSOs still had to wave their paddles in the darkness, hoping pilots would see the signals in time to react. The communication gap between platform and cockpit remained dangerously wide. Then came the Guadalcanal campaign, and the Pacific War entered its most brutal phase. Carriers operated continuously, launching strikes before dawn and recovering aircraft long after dark. The tempo of operations left no room for caution, no opportunity to wait for better conditions. Pilots flew when ordered, and they landed when they returned, regardless of whether the sun was up or down. The accident rate skyrocketed. Ship surgeons worked around the clock on mangled bodies pulled from wreckage. Repair crews performed miracles keeping the carriers operational despite aircraft slamming into barriers, careening across decks, and occasionally plunging into the ocean. Admiral William Halsey, never one to mince words, called night carrier operations the most dangerous thing his pilots did, more deadly than facing Japanese fighters or flying through anti-aircraft fire. The Navy needed its best people working on this problem, men who understood both the technical challenges and the human factors, pilots who had the experience to know what worked and the creativity to imagine what might work better. Men like Lieutenant Dick Tripp. Dick Tripp was, by all accounts, a character. Short in stature but massive in personality, Tripp brought an almost artistic sensibility to the LSO platform. Where other LSOs were methodical and by the book, Tripp added flair and improvisation to his signals. He wore coveralls instead of standard uniform, sported a dough rag instead of a regulation cap, and often worked in sock feet for better feel of the deck's movement beneath him. But beneath the unconventional appearance lay a brilliant tactical mind and an almost supernatural ability to read aircraft in flight. Fellow pilots swore Tripp had some sixth sense, an ability to predict what an aircraft would do before the pilot himself knew. Gene Balch, a radioman in a Curtiss Helldiver, put it simply, "The guy was darned near magic. Dick Tripp, for my money, was the best LSO in the whole Pacific." Tripp had been studying the night landing problem obsessively. He spent hours watching recoveries, noting what worked and what failed. He interviewed pilots about what they could and could not see from the cockpit. He experimented with different paddle positions, different timing for signals, different ways of communicating in the darkness. And gradually, Tripp began to notice patterns. Certain signals worked better at night than others. Some movements of the paddles caught the pilot's eye more effectively. Timing mattered enormously. A signal given 2 seconds too late was worthless, but one given too early left the pilot uncertain whether to maintain the correction or return to the previous approach. But Tripp's most important insight came from understanding the pilot's perspective. Most LSOs focused on what they could see, the aircraft approaching from their vantage point on the platform. Tripp forced himself to think like a pilot, to imagine what was visible from the cockpit in those final terrifying seconds before touchdown. From that perspective, everything looked different. The gentle wave-off signal that seemed clear from the platform might be completely invisible from the cockpit. The precise paddle position indicating too high could be misread in the darkness as too low. Communication was breaking down not because pilots were not looking, but because the signals themselves were not designed for the unique challenges of night operations. Tripp began experimenting with modifications to the standard signals. He made his movements more exaggerated, extending his arms further to create more contrast against the dark sky. He adjusted his timing, giving signals earlier in the approach to allow pilots more time to react. He paid attention to the lighting around the platform, positioning himself to maximize visibility. But his breakthrough came from an unexpected direction, understanding human psychology under extreme stress. Pilots approaching at night were not operating at peak cognitive ability. They were exhausted from hours of combat flying. They were stressed about fuel states, worried about damage to their aircraft, concerned about enemy fighters that might have followed them back. Their night vision was compromised by instrument lights in the cockpit. Their depth perception was essentially gone. In this state, complex signals became impossible to interpret. A pilot seeing paddles move in darkness could not always determine the exact configuration, could not always remember which signal meant what correction. The 13 distinct signals that worked so well during daytime became a confusing jumble after dark. Tripp realized that night operations needed simpler signals, not dumbed down, but refined to their absolute essence. Strip away everything except the most critical information. Make every signal unmistakable. Make every movement so clear that even an exhausted, stressed pilot could understand instantly and react correctly. He developed what he called his modified signal set. For night operations, Tripp reduced the standard 13 signals to just 5 core communications: too high, too low, good approach, wave off, and cut. But he made each of these signals dramatically more visible through a combination of position and movement. For the wave off, the most critical signal because it meant immediate danger, Tripp developed an overhead crossing motion with both paddles extended far above his head. The movement was so large, so distinctive, that it could be seen even by pilots whose vision was compromised. There was no possibility of confusion, no chance of misinterpretation. Paddles crossing overhead meant wave off, go around, do not attempt to land. For altitude corrections, Tripp added a pumping motion to his signals. Instead of simply holding paddles in a position indicating too high or too low, he moved them in a rhythmic pattern that caught the pilot's eye and conveyed urgency. The motion also indicated the severity of the deviation. Gentle pumps for small corrections, aggressive pumps for major problems. But Tripp's real genius lay in understanding the final approach phase. As aircraft came close to the deck, pilots shifted their focus from the LSO to the landing area itself. They had to judge their height above the deck, align with the centerline, prepare for touchdown. In these final seconds, they often lost sight of the LSO entirely. Traditional LSO technique called for continuing to give signals right up until the cut, the moment when the pilot chopped power and the aircraft dropped onto the deck. But Tripp realized this approach did not work at night. Pilots were not seeing those late signals, were not reacting to final corrections. By the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late to save the landing. Tripp's solution was counterintuitive but brilliant. Do all the critical work earlier in the approach. Get the aircraft perfectly positioned while the pilot could still see and react to signals, then let the pilot concentrate on the landing itself. Instead of last-second corrections that pilots could not execute, Tripp gave earlier, clearer signals that allowed pilots to establish a stable approach and ride it all the way to touchdown. This required extraordinary judgment from the LSO. Tripp had to predict where the aircraft would be in 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. He had to anticipate how deck motion would affect the approach, how wind would push the aircraft, how pilot technique would influence the final touchdown. He had to see the future, and he had to be right every single time. Spring of 1944. Yorktown was operating off the Marshall Islands, conducting round-the-clock strikes against Japanese positions. The schedule was brutal. Launch before dawn, recover at dusk. Launch again for night harassment strikes, recover in total darkness. Pilots were flying 3 and 4 missions per day, catching sleep in brief intervals between flights. The other carriers in the task force were experiencing devastating night landing accident rates. Aircraft were crashing, pilots were being lost, and commanders were seriously considering whether night operations were worth the terrible price. Some advocated for severely restricting night launches, arguing that the losses exceeded any tactical advantage. But Yorktown's numbers were different. Dramatically different. While other carriers in the task force were losing 5 to 10% of aircraft during night recoveries, Yorktown was bringing aircraft aboard with a success rate that seemed impossible. Week after week, Tripp and his fellow LSOs guided pilots home through conditions that were claiming aircraft on every other carrier in the fleet. Commander of the Air Group noticed. The captain noticed. Admiral Mitcher noticed. Visits were arranged. LSOs from other carriers came aboard Yorktown to watch Tripp work. At first, they could not understand what he was doing differently. The signals looked similar. The technique seemed familiar, but the results were undeniable. What they did not immediately see were the subtle differences, the small modifications that added up to a completely different approach to night recoveries. Tripp's exaggerated movements, his earlier timing, his simplified signal set, his focus on getting aircraft established on a good approach rather than making last-second corrections. Tripp shared everything freely. He explained his reasoning, demonstrated his techniques, worked with visiting LSOs to help them understand the principles behind the modifications. Some grasped it immediately, others struggled to break their ingrained habits, but slowly, gradually, Tripp's methods began spreading through the fleet. And then came the Mission Beyond Darkness, June 20th, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had been raging for 3 days. American carriers had successfully defended against massive Japanese air attacks, destroying hundreds of enemy aircraft in what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But Admiral Ozawa's fleet remained intact and was attempting to escape. Late in the afternoon, American search planes finally located the Japanese fleet, but the range was extreme. Launching a strike this late in the day meant aircraft would not return until after nightfall. Admiral Mitcher faced an impossible decision: let the Japanese fleet escape or launch a strike that would require mass night recoveries of exhausted pilots in aircraft that had been pushed beyond their normal operational limits. Mitcher made his decision. Launch the strike. 216 aircraft roared off the decks of Task Force 58 in the late afternoon sun. Pilots knew what the mission meant. They would attack the Japanese fleet in the fading light of day, and they would face the gauntlet of night, landing upon their return. Many wrote quick letters before launching, just in case. The strike found the Japanese fleet and attacked through intense anti-aircraft fire. Aircraft were damaged, some severely. Pilots were wounded. Fuel tanks were holed. And then came the long flight back, with fuel gauges dropping toward empty and darkness settling over the Pacific like a shroud. As aircraft began calling in over Task Force 58, reporting critical fuel states and requesting immediate landing, Mitcher made his second historic decision. He ordered every ship in the task force to turn on every light they had. Navigation lights, deck lights, search lights, anything that would help create a beacon for the returning aircraft. It was a violation of every blackout procedure, every tactical doctrine about maintaining stealth. Turning on lights made the task force visible for hundreds of miles, a perfect target for Japanese submarines or any aircraft that might be lurking in the darkness. But Mitcher knew his pilots needed every advantage they could get. The lights helped pilots find the task force, but finding the fleet and landing on a specific carrier were entirely different challenges. As aircraft began arriving, many were critically low on fuel. Some were damaged and barely controllable. Pilots were exhausted, stressed beyond anything they had experienced. And they all had to land, most of them on carriers they had never seen before, because they could not locate their home ship. Yorktown recovered its own aircraft first. Tripp worked his platform with focused intensity, bringing aircraft aboard one after another. Pilots who had never made a night landing before somehow found themselves safely on deck, not quite certain how they had done it. Damaged aircraft that should have crashed somehow made arrested landings. Pilots flying on nothing but fumes touched down and rolled to a stop just as their engines quit from fuel starvation. Then Yorktown began recovering orphans, aircraft from other carriers who could not find their home ships. Pilots who had never seen Yorktown before, who knew nothing about her deck characteristics, who were flying strange approaches because their fuel was critically low. These were the most dangerous recoveries, the ones most likely to end in catastrophe. But Tripp adapted. For each aircraft, he assessed the pilot's situation and adjusted his signals accordingly. A pilot who was clearly experienced got standard signals. A pilot who seemed uncertain got simplified, exaggerated signals with more guidance. A pilot who radioed that his fuel was critical got instructions to come straight in, skip the normal pattern, just get on deck now. Aircraft landed every 90 seconds. Some trapped perfectly. Some caught the last wire and nearly rolled into the barrier. Some landed long and were caught by the emergency barricade stretched across the deck. But they landed. They survived. By the time the last aircraft was recovered, over 2 hours after the first planes had arrived, Yorktown had brought aboard 83 aircraft. 14 of them were not from Yorktown's air group. They were orphans, lost birds, pilots who had found salvation on an unfamiliar deck because a man with paddles had guided them home. The losses that night across Task Force 58 were significant. 20 aircraft were lost during the attack on the Japanese fleet. Another 80 went down during recovery operations, most running out of fuel before they could land, some crashing during landing attempts. 100 pilots and aircrew were lost. But the losses could have been catastrophically worse. Without the innovations in LSO technique that men like Tripp had developed, without the improved signals and methods for night recoveries, the disaster would have been total. And aboard Yorktown, something remarkable had happened. Despite recovering 83 aircraft in complete darkness, despite handling multiple damaged aircraft and pilots who were completely unfamiliar with the ship, despite conditions that should have resulted in multiple catastrophic crashes, Yorktown suffered no fatal accidents during recovery operations. Not one pilot was lost attempting to land. Not one aircraft was destroyed on the deck. 0 fatalities. 0 aircraft destroyed. 83 successful recoveries in the worst possible conditions. The impact was immediate and undeniable. The techniques Tripp had developed, the simplified signals for night operations, the modified approach to guiding aircraft aboard, had proven themselves under the ultimate test. Other carriers demanded that their LSOs learn these methods. Training protocols were updated. The innovations that had been developed through observation and experimentation aboard one carrier became fleet-wide standard operating procedure. The statistics tell the story. In early 1943, before the adoption of improved night landing techniques, the accident rate during night carrier operations was approximately 35 mishaps per 10,000 landings. By late 1944, after the widespread adoption of modified LSO techniques and other improvements, that rate had dropped to fewer than 4 mishaps per 10,000 landings. That represents an 89% reduction in accidents. For every 10 pilots who would have crashed using the old methods, 9 now landed safely, hundreds of lives saved, hundreds of aircraft preserved. The improvement came not from new technology, not from better aircraft or sophisticated electronics, but from one simple insight. Night operations required night techniques, and communication in darkness demanded clarity above all else. Dick Tripp did not receive any medals for his innovations. His name appears in few official histories, but across the Pacific Fleet, pilots who had been brought safely aboard by his techniques remembered. After the war, when veterans gathered to tell stories, Tripp's name came up again and again. The LSO who could see in the dark. The LSO who never lost a pilot. The techniques Tripp developed continued to evolve. After the war, as jet aircraft entered carrier service, new challenges emerged. Jets approached faster, had less responsive engines, and required different handling. But the fundamental principle Tripp had established remained valid. Clear, simple, timely communication was everything. The mirror landing system, introduced in the 1950s, built upon these lessons. The angled flight deck, another British innovation, made landing safer by providing a clear area for aircraft to bolter without crashing into planes parked forward. Radio communications replaced paddle signals, allowing more detailed instructions. But through all these technological advances, the LSO remained, because the human judgment and experience could not be replaced by any machine. Modern carrier operations bear little resemblance to the night landings of World War II. Today's LSOs have sophisticated electronics, computer-generated data displays, and decades of accumulated knowledge. Aircraft have autopilots that can handle much of the approach, computers that calculate optimal landing parameters, and systems that alert pilots to dangerous conditions, yet the fundamentals remain unchanged. A pilot on final approach, exhausted after a combat mission, with darkness surrounding and a pitching deck ahead, still needs someone on the platform making judgments and providing guidance. The technology has changed, but the job has not. And when modern LSOs train, when they learn the techniques that will keep their pilots alive, they study the innovations developed by men like Dick Tripp. They learn about simplifying signals for high-stress situations. They learn about anticipating aircraft position rather than reacting to current position. They learn about adapting to individual pilot needs rather than applying one-size-fits-all procedures. They learn that technology is valuable, but judgment is irreplaceable. That clear communication saves lives. That innovation often comes not from revolutionary new systems, but from careful observation and willingness to challenge established procedures. The story of Dick Tripp and the landing signal officers of World War II teaches us something profound about problem-solving under pressure. When faced with a challenge that seems insurmountable, when existing methods are not working and people are being lost, the answer is not always more technology or more complexity. Sometimes the answer is simplification, clarity, understanding the human factors that influence performance under stress. The LSOs who stood on carrier platforms in darkness, waving paddles to guide aircraft they could barely see, were performing one of the most difficult jobs in warfare. They could not control the weather, could not make the deck stop pitching, could not give pilots better vision or more fuel. But they could control how they communicated, how they provided guidance, how they adapted to circumstances. And by focusing on what they could control, by refining their techniques to match the reality of night operations rather than blindly following procedures designed for daylight, they achieved something remarkable. They took the most dangerous operation in naval aviation and made it survivable. Not safe, never safe, but survivable. The innovation that cut night landing crashes was not a single brilliant invention. It was 1,000 small refinements, 100 adjustments to technique, dozens of observations about what worked and what did not. It was men like Dick Tripp spending hours watching aircraft land, interviewing pilots, experimenting with different approaches, and having the courage to do things differently when different was what the situation required. Today, when pilots bring their aircraft aboard carriers at night, when they make those terrifying approaches in darkness and weather, they benefit from innovations developed 80 years ago by men with paddles standing on exposed platforms in the middle of the Pacific. The technology has changed beyond recognition, but the principles remain valid. Clear communication saves lives. Simple is better than complex. Understanding the human factors matters more than perfecting the technical factors. Adaptation beats rigid procedures, and sometimes the greatest innovations come not from engineers in laboratories, but from practitioners on the front lines who pay attention to what actually works. Dick Tripp retired from the Navy after the war, returning to civilian life and largely disappearing from public view. He never sought recognition for his contributions, never wrote books or gave lectures about his techniques. For him, the job had simply been doing what needed to be done, helping his fellow pilots come home safely. But his legacy lives on every time an aircraft lands on a carrier at night. Every time an LSO brings a pilot safely aboard. Every time someone solves a difficult problem by stepping back, observing carefully, and thinking clearly about what actually matters. The paddles are gone now, replaced by radios and lights and computers. The wooden flight decks have given way to steel and anti-skid coating. The propeller-driven aircraft of World War II have been replaced by supersonic jets. But the challenge remains the same, getting pilots safely aboard ship when everything about the situation is difficult and dangerous and unforgiving. And the solution remains the same, clear signals, good judgment, and people who care enough to keep improving, keep learning, keep finding better ways to do a job that will never be easy. On a carrier deck somewhere tonight, an LSO is standing on the platform, watching aircraft approach in darkness. The technology surrounding that LSO would be incomprehensible to Dick Tripp. The aircraft would seem like science fiction, the systems and procedures would be unrecognizable, but the job would be instantly familiar. One person on a platform, watching aircraft approach, making judgments, providing guidance, bringing pilots home, keeping them safe, doing whatever it takes to ensure that every aircraft that launches also returns. That job, that mission, that absolute focus on getting people home safely, remains unchanged across 8 decades. The technology evolves, the aircraft transform, The procedures are refined. But the core responsibility, the essential task of the landing signal officer, remains exactly what it was when Dick Tripp stood on Yorktown's platform in the darkness of June 1944, bringing aircraft aboard one by one through impossible conditions. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. In a world that changes constantly, where technology advances at breathtaking speed, and yesterday's innovations become today's obsolete systems, some things remain constant. The value of clear communication, the importance of good judgment, the power of caring deeply about the people whose lives depend on your decisions. These are not old-fashioned values made obsolete by modern systems. They are timeless principles that work just as well today as they did 80 years ago. They will work just as well 80 years from now, when the technology will have evolved in ways we cannot imagine, but the fundamental challenges of getting people home safely will remain. The story of how one LSO's innovations cut night landing crashes is really the story of how clear thinking, careful observation, and dedication to a mission can overcome challenges that seem impossible. It is a story about the power of simplification in the face of complexity, about the importance of adapting procedures to reality rather than forcing reality to conform to procedures. Most importantly, it is a story about the difference one person can make. Dick Tripp was not an admiral or an engineer or a decorated hero. He was a lieutenant standing on a platform with paddles watching aircraft land. But by paying attention, by caring deeply about his fellow pilots, by having the courage to do things differently when different was what the situation required, he saved hundreds of lives and changed how the entire Navy conducted night operations. That legacy reminds us that innovation does not always come from positions of power or advanced degrees or sophisticated laboratories. Sometimes it comes from people on the front lines who see what needs to be done and figure out how to do it, who notice what works and what does not, who experiment and refine and persist until they find better ways. In the darkness of a Pacific night in 1944, with aircraft approaching on fumes and pilots flying beyond exhaustion, Dick Tripp stood on a platform and waved his paddles. He made simple signals clearer. He gave pilots earlier guidance. He adapted to each situation, rather than applying rigid procedures. And by doing these simple things with extraordinary skill and dedication, he showed that the solution to complex problems is sometimes not more complexity, but more clarity. 83 aircraft recovered, 0 fatalities, 0 aircraft destroyed. Through the worst possible conditions, in the darkness of night, with everything working against success, one LSO with paddles brought every single aircraft safely aboard. That is not just a story about World War II. That is not just a story about carrier aviation. That is a story about what becomes possible when skilled, dedicated people focus on what really matters and refuse to accept that the way things have always been done is the only way they can be done. The paddles are gone. The carriers have changed. The technology has evolved beyond recognition, but the lesson remains timeless. Clear communication, good judgment, and dedication to mission can overcome challenges that seem impossible. One person in the right place with the right skills and the right mindset can make a difference that echoes across decades. Dick Tripp stood on a platform in the darkness and brought pilots home. In doing so, he showed us all that innovation is not always about complexity or technology. Sometimes it is about seeing clearly, thinking carefully, and doing simple things exceptionally well. That lesson is worth remembering, whether we are landing aircraft on carriers or solving any other difficult challenge. Clarity over complexity, adaptation over rigid procedures, human judgment over blind faith in systems, and above all, the unwavering commitment to bringing people home safely, no matter what it takes. The lights of Task Force 58 have long since gone dark. The carriers of World War II have been scrapped or turned into museums. The pilots who flew those missions have mostly passed on, their stories becoming history. But the principles they discovered, the innovations they developed, the lessons they learned at such terrible cost, these remain. They remain in the procedures modern LSOs follow. They remain in the training new aviators receive. They remain in the mindset that says no challenge is impossible if you approach it with clarity, dedication, and willingness to find better ways. On a carrier deck tonight, an aircraft will land safely in darkness because 80 years ago, a man with paddles figured out how to communicate more clearly. That aircraft's pilot will go home to family because someone long ago cared enough to make the job safer. The mission will succeed because practitioners on the front lines paid attention to what worked and had the courage to do things differently. That is Dick Tripp's legacy. Not a medal or a memorial, but aircraft landing safely, pilots coming home, and missions succeeding because someone took the time to figure out how to do a difficult job better. In the end, that might be the best legacy of all.